So we are finishing up the French and Indian War, and we learned that the British won. And now what they are doing is we're starting to now move out of the colonies and started to go west over the Appalachian Mountains, going into the Ohio River Valley. So a lot of the colonists wanted to leave the 13 colonies and start making it their way westward into the Ohio River Valley. Now let's go over the 13 colonies again. We got New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Remember, Florida is ruled by the Spanish at this time. There'll be another war just for that. And lastly, Delaware. All right, so they wanted to go west to the Ohio River Valley. And they wanted to start setting up land there. Even George Washington had his eyes on that land also, that he wanted to start living there with his family. But what happened was the Native Americans were very angry about this. They did not want any of the British colonists moving to their land. They already got kicked out of the 13 colonies. That was their land. And I remember how the Dutch tricked them with the payment of Manhattan. So they felt very upset that they got tricked. And now they're living in the Ohio River Valley. They're starting to move out west. But now the colonists are starting to move that way now and taking over their land. And you had a leader in one of those Indians called the Pontiac. And Pontiac fought this. Yep, just like that. Got extremely angry. So they kept saying, this is our land. We do not want you living here. Well, the problem was, guys, we just had a very expensive war fighting in the French and Indian War. And King George did not want to have any more problems. So he created a new law. He didn't want any more wars. He didn't want any more fighting. So he created a border that was not, no colonists were allowed to go west of the Appalachian Mountains because that's where the Native Americans lived. That was their territory. So he created this border. And this border is known now as the Law of Proclamation of 1763. This was a very important law. This is what really started the cause, was the major cause of the American Revolution, where the 13 colonies said we need now to have our own independence from England. So the Proclamation of 1763, if you already had land that you already built a house upon and started your family and farms, you now had to go back to the east and back to the 13 colonies. You were not allowed to live there. So this was extremely unfair to the colonists. They said, you can't do this. We already built our homes, and now you're telling us to move back. And there were lots of fighting between the British soldiers and the colonists. So any of the colonists that were already in the west had to go back to the east. And this angered many of the settlers. So you had to move back east of the mountains. Not allowed to live in the Ohio River Valley.
The year is 1763. American colonists had just finished fighting the French and Indian War on behalf of their British overlords. In return, the British gave Americans parcels of land west of the Appalachian Mountains. At first, the Americans were happy, but that would soon change. Here are 5 things that you need to know about the Proclamation of 1763. In the wake of the French and Indian War, a Native American tribal leader named Pontiac was fed up with the British military presence on his land. He and other tribes launched an attack on the British, and fighting continued for the next 3 years. While the British government was already in the process of drafting the Proclamation of 1763, Pontiac's rebellion sped up its enactment. The British needed to find a way to keep Native American tribes happy, so they drew a line that effectively cut off any westward expansion by their colonies. Native Americans would be allowed to keep the area west of the Appalachians, while American colonists had to contain their settlements to the east, rendering their land grants absolutely worthless. Adding insult to injury, any colonists already settled out west were ordered to move. You see the problem? The Americans felt the proclamation was unfair, so in many cases, they just ignored it. In a few instances, British soldiers forced American frontiersmen back across the border, sometimes burning their settlements. But for the most part, enforcement was pretty weak, and colonists still sought land across the border, even if that meant breaking the law. French and Indian War hero George Washington was one of the many colonists who flouted the law and sought to purchase as much forbidden territory as possible. In a letter to his real estate agent, he dismissed the Proclamation of 1763 as a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. In other words, Washington believed the proclamation would be repealed someday, and when it was, he wanted to already have a claim to this land. One of the unintended but most significant effects of the proclamation was the universal hatred for the British it created throughout colonial America. This is one of the earliest circumstances that created an American identity, because for the first time, the 13 colonies had something in common. The British promised them land, and they didn't get it. If you're looking to find causes for the American Revolution, one of the earliest and least obvious is the Proclamation of 1763. King George thought he could contain the colonist settlements, but what he could not contain was their freedom.
To my loyal subjects in my glorious colonies, we have just defeated the French and their Indian allies, and now have control over their lands. We have banded together during this war, and shown others how strong we are. Even though we were victorious, this war was very costly. Much money was spent, and many brave men died. In order to keep you safe, we must prevent further conflict with the native people. Therefore, today I proclaim no colonial settlers will be allowed to cross the Appalachian Mountains into Indian territory. We shall not bother the Indians on the western side of the mountains, and all settlers will remain firmly on the eastern side. If you have already settled west of this new boundary, you must return to the safety of the eastern side. In order to keep the border safe, I will be sending additional troops to my colonies. Do not forget that you are subjects of Britain and must obey my laws.